Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good evening, everyone. Okay, we have been discussing the Mahasakuludayi Sutta. This is Sutta number 77 in the middle length discourses. And so far I've gone through all of the sections on the 37 Bodhipakkhya Dhammas, the 37 aids to enlightenment, which are grouped into the 7 sets. And last week we studied the different sets and their the interrelationships of the different factors. And so that takes us through section number 21 of the sutta. Okay, now normally we would come to section 22, or paragraph 22, section 8, but I would find it easier to explain in a somewhat different sequence and to go ahead to section 10 on page 640 and then work backwards. Because several of the liberations and the basis for transcendence, that's in sections 8 and 9, are actually developments out of the kasinas. So if I explain the kasinas first, then it becomes easier to understand these liberations and basis for mastery, a basis for transcendence. Okay, so in paragraph 24, the Buddha says to this wanderer, Sakuludayi, he says, "Again, Udayan, I have proclaimed to my disciples the way to develop the 10 kasina bases." In Pali, what's called the 10 kasina bases are called the 10 kasinayatana. Actually, 10 kasinayatanani. One of them is called kasinayatana. The word kasina is a little bit obscure. Do you know what the Chinese translators use for it? Oh, the shu is 10. Shu. Ibian. All inclusive. Yeah, that's exactly the original meaning of the Pali. The sense is that of being universal, all-pervading. And we see that sense in the description. But like the word kasina has sort of taken in the usage in the Theravada tradition, it's taken on a sort of momentum of its own so that everybody, or at least the meditators, all know the word kasina, and nobody knows or thinks of the original meaning of the word, but it just becomes known as a particular type of meditation object. But the original sense is that of all-pervasiveness or universality. And we see this in the description given in the text. One contemplates, but better, I just checked the Pali originally. I just checked the original Pali text. And the word translated here, contemplates, is sanjanati, which is perceives. Would have been better to translate quite literally. One perceives the earth kasina above, below, and across, undivided and immeasurable. That's where the sense of kasina is coming from, the sense of universality or all-pervasiveness. Okay, another perceives the water kasina. Another perceives the fire kasina. Another perceives the air kasina. Okay, so these are kasinas which signify the four primary elements. Then we come to four kasinas that signify or represent the four major colors. Okay, one perceives the blue kasina. Another perceives the yellow kasina. Another perceives the red kasina. Another perceives the white kasina. Okay, so now we have 8 kasinas. Then another perceives the space kasina, and another perceives the consciousness kasina, above, below, and across, undivided and immeasurable, and thereby many disciples of mine abide, having reached the perfection and consummation of direct knowledge. Okay, now what exactly is meant here by perceiving, say, one of these elements or one of these colors all over, undivided? This is non-dual, advayam, and immeasurable, appamanam. Okay, this is the kind of very advanced, you call it very advanced yogic or meditative practice. And if we just take the text itself, it's quite difficult to understand exactly what's going on and how one gets there. But basically what is involved at this advanced level is taking a perception based upon first one or another of the four primary elements, or a perception based upon one or another of these colors, and then developing this perception in meditation in such a way that this particular perception focused on the element or the color becomes exclusive, that one is focused exclusively upon this percept. All other perceptions are excluded. This is a samadhi practice, a practice in concentration, one-pointedness of mind. And one is able to take this perception, be it of the element or of color, and then extend this perception, expand it to the point that the entire perceptual field becomes covered with that percept, so that perception becomes undivided. There's no differentiation, no distinctions in that perception. And it's immeasurable or boundless. It seems to be covering the whole universe. And the text itself is describing, as I said, it's a quite advanced stage in meditation. But the Buddhist tradition has worked out quite systematically concrete ways to reach these more advanced stages. How much of this goes back to the time of the Buddha? How much goes back to some generations later, to the days when ancient teachers were trying to devise more concrete, more specific steps for developing this? I don't know. I suspect that probably a lot draws upon already sort of ancient yogic knowledge that was already existing in the time of the Buddha. But some of this still exists within the hermitages and meditation retreat centers in the Theravada countries. And so I've actually seen Kasina objects, and I know what they look like. Okay, now this Kasina base, or perception of the Kasina, is developed on the basis initially of a Kasina object, or what's called the Kasina device. In Pali, it's actually called the Kasina mandala. The word mandala becomes fashionable through Tibetan Buddhism with all the different figures in the mandala. But the word mandala itself just means circle or sphere, so that they speak about the Surya mandala is the circle of the sun, Chanda mandala will be the circle of the moon, and a Kasina mandala is a circle that is the basis for a Kasina object. And so the instructions are given in the commentarial work called the Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification, and it uses at the basis for its detailed instructions the earth Kasina. And so in the monasteries, the meditation monasteries in Sri Lanka, the most popular Kasinas are either the earth Kasina or one of the color Kasinas. Water Kasina, fire Kasina, air Kasina. I have to say, I just don't know how they would be made or used. So there are instructions given in the Visuddhimagga, but I don't know anyone who's actually used them. But the earth Kasina, one will take a circular rim, say a wooden rim. The circle could be about, it's called diameter, maybe about 18 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches. Should be very, as close to being a perfect circle as possible. And then one fills it with clay, so that it really has an earthen appearance. It should be made extremely smooth. Sorry, red-brown clay. So that color, it really represents, signifies when one looks at it, the earth, has the sense of the earth. Okay, then the meditator will go to his meditation quarters and set up the device some distance away from him, not too far, not too close. It could be about 2 feet away. Setting it up on a stand so that he could look at it clearly, or putting it, if he's sitting on a raised platform, he could put it on a lower platform so that he's looking down at it. And he looks at it for a certain amount of time, just focusing his mind on it with the idea, earth, earth, earth. Then closing the eyes, and with the eyes closed, trying to visualize that device. Again, thinking earth, earth, earth. Then opening the eyes for a little, closing the eyes. And one keeps on doing this hour after hour, day after day, until one is able to, at some point, one is able to perceive the Kasina disc, the earth disc, as clearly with the eyes closed as with the eyes open. So even with the eyes closed, one is seeing the disc as vividly as distinctly, as lifelike, as though one's eyes were open. And when one reaches this degree of clarity of perception of the mentally visualized object, then one no longer has to rely upon the physical object. So if one's perception starts to fade, and if one gets involved with busy work, activities, and one is not focusing so distinctly upon that inner image, then one might have to go back and work with the actual physical device. But if one is just maintaining a consistency in practice and can visualize the disc, then one leaves the physical object alone and just works with the mental image. And then one goes on visualizing that mental image, which is now it's called the learning sign, Ugahanimmita, or acquired sign, because one has picked it up, acquired, because one has picked it up off the physical object, the kasina device, and it has now become something imprinted upon one's mental visual field. And so one works with this acquired or visualized sign, again developing the perception, earth, 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 until out of that visualized sign there will come a brighter, more radiant, more purified object representing the earth. That is what is called technically it's called the Patibhaga Nimitta, which is sometimes translated the counterpart sign. I'll write these terms on the board. Okay, when the counterpart sign arises, the Patibhaga Nimitta, at that time the 5 hindrances subside. They go into a state of suspension, and the mind enters the state which is called, in the commentaries it's called access or neighborhood concentration, upachara samadhi. And then by continuing to focus repeatedly upon this counterpart sign, eventually the mind will go into, if the faculties become stronger and stronger, the mind will go into jhana, or meditative absorption upon the object, the kasina object. Now, initially, for most meditators, there might be a few exceptions, when one works with the sign, the first experiences in the jhana, the sign, the object, the kasina object, will be a limited object. There will be a circle, a sphere of limited dimensions. But after the meditator gains a certain degree of versatility, flexibility, a skill in attaining the jhana based upon that limited perception of the kasina, he will then work at expanding the kasina object. This is turning it into a true kasina object. One will take the object mentally perceived object, and work on extending its dimensions, so that the circumference of the disc that one is perceiving becomes larger, 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 until eventually one reaches a point where one can just determine that all boundaries fall away, and then that particular perception will then just spread out and extend over the entire universe, so that the entire mental field, mentally visualized field, in the case of the earth kasina, will just be that perception of earth. And it's at that point that one is, as the text says, one perceives the earth kasina above, below, and across, undivided and immeasurable. Okay, with the water kasina, the way that's recommended in Visuddhimagga is to take a cup or a bowl of water and then set that up in front of you. And then you use that as your object, focusing upon that. And one is not attending to the color, the shape, but focusing again and again on the water quality of that water until one gets a perception of water. And then one develops that perception in the same way. And then to get the fire kasina, one takes a blazing fire, and of course one can't go too close to it, but from a certain distance, one takes a board and one cuts a circle in the board, and one sets up the fire at a distance, and one puts the board with the circle in front of the fire, so through the circle and the board, one is seeing the fire, blazing fire. And then one focuses upon that fiery features, the fiery characteristics of the fire. The air kasina, it's a little obscure to me. And it seems to me that to develop the element kasinas, unless one has previous experience from previous lives, that one has a natural ability for this type of meditation, it seems to me one would have to begin with either the earth kasina or one of the color kasinas. And then once one develops the skill, one should be able to pick up the other element kasinas fairly easily, because then one knows what is involved, one knows what is involved, one has that power of concentration. All one has to do is focus that power of concentration upon a different element. Okay, so with a color kasina, one will take the circular disc, and it will be colored a blue kasina, of course it's colored blue, yellow kasina, yellow, red kasina, colored red, white kasina, it's colored white. The space kasina is actually the same thing as the base of infinite space. But in order to develop that, one has to begin with a limited space and then start expanding that limited space until it becomes boundless. And then the consciousness kasina is the same as the base of infinite consciousness, which we'll come to shortly. And that is developed on the basis of the space, of the base of infinite space. So in the commentaries, like the Visuddhimagga, or in the commentarial system, which is elaborated in the Visuddhimagga, what is called the space kasina is explained as a limited space, because that is what one develops as a starting point for developing infinite space. And the consciousness kasina gets replaced by what is called the light kasina, because the base of infinite consciousness is included in the Visuddhimagga system as one of the 4 formless meditation subjects. And so, in order to complete the 10 kasinas, in place of the consciousness kasina, they include the light kasina. The light kasina, one takes a light, a bright light, could be the light of the sun, though one shouldn't stare at the sun, of course. One just looks at it briefly and then visualizes. Or the light of a moon. Or it could be the light of a candle, focusing upon it in the aspect of light, not the aspect of fire. And then one goes on visualizing that light, visualizing the light flooding into the mind until one acquires the sign, the inward visualized sign of light. Okay, so these are the 10 kasina bases. Now I'll ask if there's any questions, very specific. I don't want to go off on too many tangents, but if there's any questions that relate fairly directly to what I explained.
Okay, I'm not clear about the difference between the acquired sign and the counterpart sign. The acquired sign is when you have visualized the kasina device until you can keep your eyes closed and
Yeah.
But I'm not clear about what the counterpart sign is.
Okay, the acquired sign is a mentally visualized replica of the physical object, the kasina device. It's the mental perception of the kasina device that you see with your eyes closed as clearly as if your eyes were open. And so when you gain the acquired sign, it's an indication of increasing, improving concentration. And one goes on focusing upon the acquired sign. And as one does so, at a certain point when the concentration, the quality of concentration improves, then from the acquired sign, the patibhaga sign emerges, and the patibhaga sign is said to be 100 times, 1,000 times brighter, more beautiful, very luminous, very vivid. The Visuddhimagga uses the simile of the acquired sign is like the moon on a cloudy night when you're looking up at the moon and you just see the moon behind the cloud. Then when the winds come and blow the clouds away, and then the moon emerges from behind the clouds, very bright and radiant. That is like the patibhaga nimitta, the counterpart sign emerging from the acquired sign.
You had mentioned that you hadn't met anyone who did certain of these techniques, or did you mean that you hadn't met anyone who did any of them?
No. What I meant is that I don't know anybody who is actually, in fact I have to take this back, I think I do know some who have done all the kasinas. But I haven't actually discussed with anybody how they do water kasina, fire kasina, or air kasina.
Are the different kasinas better suited for different temperaments? And also, how do they compare to mindfulness of the breath as a meditation module? And why hasn't kasina been adopted in the Western?
Two questions. There's some alignment of kasinas with temperaments in the Visuddhimagga. I don't remember exactly how it's done. I would say that the kasinas are not as widely practiced in Buddhist countries as the meditation subjects that are fit within the Satipatthana system. And then the mindfulness of breathing is taken to be the root or base meditation subject for the entire Satipatthana system. And there are not so many teachers who practice the kasinas and know them well. And also I should add something as a kind of caution in case anybody is inspired to start with the kasina. It's said that one should not practice kasina on one's own. One should do it under the guidance of a teacher who is experienced in the use of kasinas. The reason is because when one is working with this mentally visualized object, one danger is that the mind could start superimposing its own visualizations onto that object and get carried away by one's own visualizations.
That's a practice in Zen, right? They stare at a blank wall, and you actually have to stare at the blank wall sitting, and what starts to happen to you is you start seeing, from somebody who told me, that you start seeing things like little cartoons and stuff start happening. The mind is like on a blank wall, kind of like giving visualizations of it. And you have to get past that.
That might happen, but it's somewhat different with the kasina. Because when the kasina image emerges, that's not like a preliminary state. That's already, the mind is getting into a high state of concentration. And so if one gets carried away by one's visualizations, the mind can get really carried away by them. There's mindfulness of breathing. I have to say, it's a much safer meditation object. Okay, I think we should go on. Okay, now from 24, I backtrack now to 23. And we have something called the 8 bases for transcendence, or 8 bases for mastery. And these are really 8 types of methods for the mastery of the mind, or mastery of jhana, or mastery of samadhi. Again, these seem to be types of yogic practice that might have been existing even prior to the time of the Buddha, that the Buddha has absorbed into his system. Okay, so let us see what the 8 types or 8 bases for transcendence are. Okay, first, perceiving form internally, one sees forms externally, limited, fair and ugly. Then, by transcending them, one perceives thus, I know, I see. This is the first base for transcendence. Okay, this exercise, and here I'm really, for an understanding of it, I'm heavily dependent upon the commentary. This exercise seems to be explaining how one goes about acquiring the nimitta, the sign that is the basis for the meditative absorption, the samadhi. So when it says perceiving form internally, one sees forms externally. Okay, by perceiving form internally, according to the commentary, what is meant is that one uses as the initial object for a color kasina some colored object on one's own body. For example, for the blue kasina, the commentary gives the example of using hair. That is because in India people have black hair, which sometimes could have a bluish, when it's fresh hair, it seems to have a bluish tint to it. So it's a kind of bluish black. So that could be taken as blue. Or to get the red kasina, one might take the red of blood. Or the white kasina, the white of the eyes. Or for the yellow kasina, maybe just a yellowish area of skin, this area of skin that appears to be yellow. And it would seem that yogis who are very skilled in samadhi can just take quite a normal, ordinary object, like a simple part of the body, and sort of pick the color off that. The way we might just pick up an object off the top of a table. And they pick the color off that part of the body and then just use it as a focal point of concentration. And so one goes on using this particular part of the body as one's focal point of concentration, so one is perceiving form internally. But then somehow the perception of forms then arises externally. That is when the concentration sharpens, then one is perceiving the forms as though they are external to oneself, within one's field of vision. And now the forms are described as limited, that is, they're still a small size, bounded form. And sometimes the form might be nice, attractive, so it's fair. Sometimes the form might still be ugly, deformed, not yet perfect. But using this form, whether it's fair or ugly, at a certain point one enters into absorption upon that form. That is called transcending them. It doesn't mean that one leaves behind the form, but one takes that form as the basis of one's concentration. And it seems that even with the ugly form or unattractive form, the concentration can develop up to the level of jhana. And so one enters into jhana, into absorption, based on that form, whether fair or ugly, but it's limited. And then the commentary says, that the transcending of the forms is the attainment of absorption together with the arising of the sign. But actually the sign arises first, and then as one continues to, the counterpart sign arises first, then as one continues to work with the counterpart sign, one enters into absorption. And then, again, this is the way the commentary explains it, when one emerges from the absorption, not within the absorption, but when one comes out, then there arises this perception, I know, I see. It's a bit obscure. Okay, so this is the first base for transcendence. Okay, the second base for transcendence, again, one gets the initial object, could be some color, off one's own body. Then one initially starts to see the forms externally, one is visualizing the forms externally. But now one is able to extend the form to the point that it becomes immeasurable. It seems that this happens even before going into the jhana. And then transcending them, that is, one goes into absorption based on this immeasurable form. And then emerging, one perceives, thus I know, I see. Okay, the third base of mastery, not perceiving form internally. That is, here one begins by taking an external form object. Could be some device that one has created, like a colored object. And one uses that as one's object. And the rest is, as explained under the first base of mastery. Okay, the fourth one, not perceiving form internally, that is, one begins with some external object as the base, the device for the color. Then one visualizes that color till one could see the forms externally. But now they are immeasurable, fair and ugly. Then one gains absorption upon them. Okay, so those are the first four bases for mastery. Now, the next four are kasina meditations that have beautiful colors as their objects. Okay, number 5, not perceiving forms externally. One sees forms externally. Blue of blue color, blue in appearance with blue luminosity, just like a flax flower, which is blue of blue color, blue in appearance with blue luminosity, or just like Benares cloth, which is blue of blue color, blue in appearance with blue luminosity. So too one perceives forms externally. One perceives forms externally that are of a beautiful blue color. Okay, this seems to be the case now where the meditator begins with some external object. He might even begin with a blue, it could be a blue disc, or one could even take a natural object like a bunch of blue flowers, putting them together, or even the blue sky, blue stretch of blue sky. If one is skilled enough, one could just take the color of the sky as one's object and work with that blue until there will arise immediately, of course with some practice, but there arises a very beautiful blue colored kasina. It's like quite bright, luminous, and then one enters into absorption based upon that blue. The next one is a kasina based upon a yellow object. And here the visualized object is yellow, of yellow color, yellow in appearance, with yellow luminosity. Just like something called the kanikara flower. The 7th one is the colored kasina, which is red, with red appearance, red color, like the hibiscus flower. And then the 8th one is the color kasina that is white, of white color, white luminosity, which is like the morning star. And in each case, one takes that beautiful color and one enters into absorption upon it. Okay, and then based upon these absorptions, then one will go on to develop insight and then liberation. Okay, from number 9, now we come backwards again to number 8. We come to the 8 liberations. And now these should be easy to explain, easy to understand. Okay, though the word liberation is used here, the Pali word is vimokkha, and this is a little bit different, actually it's very different from the word vimutti. By liberation, here is not meant really the liberation from birth and death, liberation from samsara. But this is a temporary liberation of the mind from defilements or from obstructive states. Which is brought about through the development of certain meditative skills. Okay, the first Let me just put on the board a little table which is my understanding of the relation between the 8 liberations and the 8 bases for transcendence. Then this will make my explanation clear. Okay, so now the first liberation, that is possessed of material form, one sees forms. This seems to correspond to the first 2 bases for transcendence, where one takes the original form object off one's own body and one uses that as the focus point, the meditative object, for gaining a perception, a meditative perception of forms. And then that meditative perception of forms becomes the object through which one gains absorption, samadhi or jhana. Okay, the second liberation, not perceiving form internally, one sees forms externally. This corresponds to the basis for transcendence number 3 and 4. That is, not perceiving form internally, one sees forms externally. In the one case, limited. In the other case, immeasurable, fair and ugly. And then on this basis, one gains meditative absorption or samadhi. Okay, so one doesn't take the form from one's own body, but one starts off with some external object. One works with that external object until one gains the meditative perception of form. But the form might be fair and ugly. It's not necessarily beautiful. Or definitely it's not beautiful. But then we come to the third liberation, which is described as one is resolved only upon the beautiful. And this, to me, I understand to correspond to the basis for transcendence 5, 6, 7, and 8, where one has these beautiful, luminous colors as the objects of perception. And it's said, I've heard it said, that these colors that one sees in this samadhi is supposed to be 100, 1,000 times more beautiful than any colors that we see with our fleshly eyes. Okay, then number 4, the liberations, number 4 to 7 are the 4 formless liberations, 4 formless absorptions. Okay, to gain the first, the base of infinite space, first one gains the mastery over a jhana based upon one of the kasinas. And then one expands the kasina till it becomes boundless and immeasurable. And one gains a certain degree of flexibility, versatility in working with that expanded kasina object. After one gains that mastery, and one has to gain the mastery through the 4th jhana, the 4th absorption, what one then does is to mentally remove the color or remove that element, If it's the earth kasina, one removes the earth. If it's a color kasina, blue kasina, say, one removes the blue. And one removes any other form that might appear to fill up what is left, until all that remains in one's mentally perceived space is space itself. Space extending boundlessly without limits. And then that is the meditation in the base of infinite space. Then, after one gains a degree of mastery over the base of infinite space, one becomes familiar with it, one can move in and out of it with ease. To go to the next level, one enters into the base of infinite space, emerges from it, and then one determines to focus, when going into it, upon the aspect. When one is in the base of infinite space, there is consciousness which is pervading that space, which is aware of that space. So instead of focusing upon the space, one focuses upon the consciousness. And through determination and repeated practice, the space falls away, and there is just consciousness extending boundlessly. Then after one gains mastery over that, then to go to the base of nothingness. And this is not awareness or realization of emptiness. It's not an insight realization. It's purely a practice in samadhi. What one does is to focus in the base of infinite consciousness. There's an aspect of, you call it unobstructedness or intangibility, unimpededness, and so one focuses upon that aspect of unimpededness, unobstructedness, until the awareness of consciousness falls away, and there is just that awareness of the unimpeded nature or unobstructed nature of that attainment. And then to go to the base of neither perception nor non-perception, I forgot. There's some explanation, I don't remember. But anyway, in the base of neither perception nor non-perception is called this because in that attainment, the perception, there's a perception present, but it is so subtle, so refined, that we cannot say that it is performing the actual function of perception, the normal function of perception. So we cannot say that perception is fully there, nor can it be denied that perception is there. So it's said neither perception nor non-perception. Okay, now to go from the perception, from the base of neither perception nor non-perception to the eighth liberation, cessation of perception and feeling, it's not simply a matter of progressing one step further in the field of concentration. To go through the first 7 liberations, that is a process of progressive refinement of samadhi, of concentration. But to enter upon the cessation of perception and feeling, the 8th liberation, that requires the attainment, it requires the exercise of both insight and concentration. And it is said that the base of the cessation of feeling and perception is accessible only to non-returners and arahants. Maybe I will save the explanation of this for next time, since it's actually getting late now. So next time I will explain the attainment of the base of the attainment of cessation of perception and feeling, and then conclude the sutta. But I have to say that almost everything else we've done. So after this sutta, I want to do sutta number 66. That is the simile of the quail. Latu ki kokama sutta. So please make a note of that. Sutta number 66. I had moved it here from in our syllabus. And please also make a note that I won't be here on June 7th. So there won't be a class that day. Okay, if there's any questions, then please come out with them.
I wondered about the connection of Tibetan practices with the visual practices here, and at this point I begin to see some connection.
With the visualizations in Tibetan Buddhism, because I don't know too much about that. I just know that from what I've heard that they're more complex, and that one takes a mandala in the Tibetan sense, which is a sphere in which there are many figures, and then one has to visualize all of the details within that particular sphere. But probably that approach to meditation would have, and the Kasina approach, would have both grown out of this undercurrent of yogic meditation, which carried through in the Indian tradition from very ancient times. David?
Well, maybe you went over this, but what is the sign that you might have attained the first jhana? Because in a lot of my reading, I'm finding out that there are people who think they've attained like the first jhana, but they actually haven't. So how do you know if you have or you haven't?
Maybe I'll explain that next week then, since I'm taking the jhanas next week. Any questions? George?
This sutta seems to have been compiled later. It's not something that Venerable Ananda would have recited. The way I read this, it seems to be a compilation and a consolidation of many aspects.
Yeah, what I would say, in fact, this is what we can determine from comparison with its counterpart, which is preserved in the Chinese agamas, Chinese translation from an earlier either Prakrit or Sanskrit. I mentioned this several classes ago when we started the sutta. Okay, up to page 636, the section on the Four Noble Truths, there's very close parallelism between the two versions. Then when we come to the section here called The Way to Develop Wholesome States, the version preserved in the Chinese Tripitaka has just, I think it's, you've been reading the Chinese version, Ken? I think it's just the recollection of previous lives and then the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas, of the defilements. Just those two sections, which seems more likely to have been original, which has a greater credibility, because it keeps the sutta, each section it keeps roughly of equal length. So it seems at a certain point, since the Buddha says that he has explained to his disciples, well, he doesn't use the phrase how to develop wholesome states. That seems to be just the heading that maybe Venerable Nyanamoli had used on his own as a way to classify this. But it seems that the compilers within the Pali tradition used this particular section as a way to bring in many other teachings of the Buddha in order to make this almost like a little bit of an encyclopedia or a compendium of different teachings that were given by the Buddha. So it becomes like a compendium of practices that were taught. But all of the sections included here do come from other parts of the canon, so you cannot say that they were fabricated. We do have, of course, the 37 Bodhipakkhya Dhammas, or the 7 sets, come repeatedly in the canon. The 8 liberations, 8 bases for transcendence we find elsewhere. The 10 kasinas elsewhere. The 4... Excuse me?
Are the 10 kasinas covered in the Samyutta?
Not in the Samyutta. Actually, they're mentioned in several places in the Anguttara Nikaya, and of course in the Digha Nikaya also. It's I think a later, the places where they come in the Digha Nikaya are later inclusions. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is known to be a composite sutta, and in a sutta spoken by Venerable Sariputta, which is a kind of compendium of the doctrine towards the end of the Buddha's teaching career, a way to bring all of the different elements of the doctrine together so that they would all be preserved.
Am I right in assuming that a Buddha image should not be used as a kasina?
A Buddha image would not be used initially as a kasina, but I've heard of monks who start off using a Buddha image as a basis for developing Buddhanusati, the recollection of the Buddha. Then once they get the recollection of the Buddha, sometimes they have a visualized image of the Buddha, And so what one could then do is focus upon, sometimes one will see different colored aura around the Buddha. One will focus upon one of the colors of that aura and magnify that particular color, and then one will develop a color kasina off that color. And then the image of the Buddha sort of fades out and the color becomes prominent. And then one develops that into a colored kasina. Okay, I think we have to stop now. Time is run out. Okay, we do the sharing of the merits. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahedika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahedika punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahedika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang param. Etavata chaham hehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe deva anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata jam hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhuta anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata jam hehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya.